Alrighty, all of my devices are now saying 11 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone out there in our Zoom webinar. My name is Jillian Cobb, and I'm the public programs producer here at the National Nordic Museum. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's program, an exploration of Washington's biodiversity, landscapes, ecosystems, and species. This is an exhibition-related program for Søren Solkær, Source Soul. This program we'll have a Q&A afterwards, so please feel free to submit any questions as they come to you into the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the chat. Today's guest speaker is Joe Rocchio, a program manager of the Natural Heritage Program with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. The Washington Natural Heritage Program connects conservation science with conservation actions by collecting, maintaining, and distributing data on rare species and ecosystems, as well as providing a number of other services and products in support of conservation in Washington. So a little bit about today's program. Washington's landscapes support diverse ecosystems that are home to more than 2,600 native vascular plant species, thousands of mosses, lichens, and liverworts, and fungi, 140 mammals, 451 freshwater and marine fishes, 341 birds, 25 amphibians, 28 reptiles, and more than 20,000 species of invertebrates. That's kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around a little bit. Some of these species are unique to Washington and not found anywhere else on Earth. So with that, I am going to pass things over to Joe to lead us on our virtual trek through Washington's diverse and beautiful terrestrial landscapes and learn about the incredible variety of life that underpins Washington's natural beauty. So I'll pass it over to you, Joe.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks to the National Nordic Museum for inviting me to speak today. As part of my professional duties over the years, I've been very fortunate to have been able to walk through most of Washington's ecosystems in all corners of the state, and I've seen some amazing places and observed a lot of amazing and incredible critters. So I'm excited today to be able to share some of that with you and demonstrate Washington's incredible natural heritage. Our focus will be on terrestrial biodiversity, primarily because that is where my expertise is at, but we will come across some freshwater and marine ecosystems and species as well. So with that, let's get going. To start things off, I want to introduce some basic definitions, and the first one is, of course, biodiversity. I think most of us think of biodiversity as the number of species in an area, and that's absolutely part of the definition. But the way that my colleagues and I look at this is really kind of at a multi-scales. One is landscape diversity, ecosystem diversity, species diversity, of course, and then genetic diversity of species populations themselves. So biodiversity is a result of many ecological factors, and we're going to just briefly look at a few of the drivers that determine Washington's biodiversity. So first, Washington State, for those who aren't local, is located in the extreme northwest corner of the coterminous United States. The topography of the state is quite varied. We have numerous mountain ranges, as well as past volcanic activity, which has added a lot of relief to the landscape. And then glaciation, as well as our climate over time, have slowly eroded that landscape into what we see today. Elevations in the state range from sea level, of course, in the Puget Sound and along the outer coast, to over 14,000 feet, 14,400 something, I can't remember the exact 17 feet maybe, over nearly 4,400 meters at Mount Rainier. So pretty wide range of elevations. The geology of the state is quite varied. The Columbia Basin, as well as the Southern Cascades, are primarily dominated by volcanic rocks. The northern tier of the state, as you can see here, lots of a variety of colors, indicating a really diverse mix of metamorphic sedimentary and volcanic rocks. So a wide range of rock types, including some unusual rock types such as limestone and serpentine, at least unusual for Washington, which results in some unique effects on biodiversity. And then the Puget Sound region, as you see here, is underlain by glacial deposits. And then the Olympic Peninsula is dominated by both sedimentary volcanic rocks as well as glaciated features. And speaking of glaciation, past glacial periods have had a significant impact on Washington. This bluish green area is the extent of where continental ice had extended into the state. And you can see the northern third of the state was affected by this continental ice. Also, there's alpine glaciers that came out of our mountains, indicated here by these magenta areas. And then another interesting glacial feature in the state, there was a series of ice age glacial lakes, and they were dammed by the continental ice, and those dams would periodically break, resulting in these massive floods that would stream across eastern Washington, as indicated by these orange areas here. And those floods just stripped all the topsoil off the landscape and carved a really unusual features such as scablands and coulees and other unique features that we'll circle back to. So this map shows the average temperature of the coldest month, so about January across the state. Darker blue indicates colder temperatures, lighter blue, warmer temperatures. And you can see that the coldest temperatures are in the mountains, of course, but also in the northern, north central part of the state. And also some other things to take notice, the Columbia Basin and the Puget Lowlands are about similar elevations, but you'll notice that the Columbia Basin is colder than the Puget Sound region. Now we're looking at the opposite end, which is the average temperature of the warmest month. So generally July or August, and the warmest temperatures are in the Columbia Basin. Again, you can see how warm here. Red are warm and blue cold, as is commonly found here. The Puget Sound region and the outer coast are relatively mild. And again, notice the difference between the Columbia Basin, which can get really hot in the summer, versus the Puget Lowlands, which are warm, but not quite as hot as the Columbia Basin, even though they're at that as relatively similar elevation. So precipitation is highly variable across the state. In fact, the wettest spot in the lower 48 of the United States is found in the Olympic Mountains. Over 200 inches of rain, or over 500 centimeters per year, fall in this area. But then over in eastern Washington, the Columbia Basin, the Columbia River, there's an area that gets about 6 inches of rain, or about 15 centimeters per year. So again, a very wide range of precipitation. The mountains in the state have a very strong effect on precipitation patterns. The Cascades create a rain shadow effect in eastern Washington, and the Olympic Mountains also create their own rain shadow effect in this portion of the Puget Trough, so the San Juan Islands and up into Skagit and Whatcom County. So this map essentially kind of integrates a lot of those precipitation temperature factors, and really what it's really demonstrating here is that eastern Washington, or areas east of the Cascade Crest, have what we call a continental climate. The temperature extremes are much wider than a maritime climate, which is what western Washington has. The Pacific Ocean just keeps things moderated in western Washington, so temperatures are relatively mild year-round. So landscape units can be developed to generalize these broad ecological patterns and start to make a little bit of sense out of them. One way to do that is to use a concept called an ecoregion. And an ecoregion has a distinct pattern of species composition adapted to the region's climate, topography, geology, all those factors we were just talking about. Washington has 9 ecoregions, which are depicted here on this map. And you can see that all of these ecoregions extend into adjacent states as well as up into Canada. So we don't have any ecoregions that's only found in Washington. Within each ecoregion, a large diversity of ecosystems are found. Ecosystems include things like a salt marsh or a rainforest, a bog, or shrub steppe. Some ecosystems are restricted to 1 or 2 ecoregions, but many are found in multiple ecoregions. In turn, each individual ecosystem supports a distinct assemblage of species as well. And like ecosystems, some species can occur in more than one ecosystem, just like ecosystems in more than one ecoregion, or they could be restricted to a specific ecosystem type. So despite kind of this lack of a one-to-one relationship, ecoregions and ecosystems still are really a useful way for us to categorize the landscape and develop a common language to talk about landscape and ecosystem diversity. So just like we use ecoregions to categorize landscape diversity, we need a system to do the same for ecosystems. Our program, the Natural Heritage Program that I work with, we use what's called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification to categorize Washington's ecosystem types. The USMVC is what we call a nested hierarchy. which means the lowest level is embedded in the highest scale. And the course's and most basic level of this classification is called a class. So in this example here, a forest and woodland class. And as you move down through the hierarchy, each unit is split into increasingly more detailed categories based on all of those ecological factors I was talking about, as well as many we haven't talked about yet. So that by the time you get down to this level 8 association, you're really talking about a very fine scale ecosystem. And you can just look at the numbers here in red. In Washington, we have 6 different classes, but down to the association level, we have over 1,000 associations. So very fine scale by the time we get to that. But the point being, we often get asked, how many ecosystems do we have in Washington? And it really depends on a couple things. One, what ecosystem classification are you using? And two, in the case of this one, which level in the classification are you going to use to answer that question? So our program primarily uses what we call this group level to answer that question. How many ecosystems do we have in the state? And there are about 68 of those. Having said all that, I'm actually not gonna use this classification to talk about ecosystems moving forward, just because I want to limit the technical jargon we're going to be playing with here and out. But I did want to introduce you to that because it is a systematic way that we talk about how our ecosystems. And if you want to learn more, I'd be happy to answer questions or direct you to resources about that. So here on out, I'm really just going to use more generalized ecosystem concepts to talk about the variation we're going to see on our little journey. All right, so altogether, Washington's ecosystems type support a diversity of species, as was mentioned in the introduction. Many of these species are unique to Washington and not found anywhere else on Earth. And these are what we call Washington endemic species. So for example, 84 plants have their entire global range within the state of Washington. The Olympic Mountains, Wenatchee Mountains, and the Columbia River Gorge and Columbia Plateau are all rich in these endemic plants. All right, so now we're going to embark on our journey here. Unfortunately, we don't have time to visit all 9 ecoregions, but I've selected a subset of ecoregions that I think will give us a good representation of the diversity of the state. And as we visit each ecoregion, we'll see a few ecosystems and species that are representative or rare within that particular ecoregion. So we'll start our journey in the northeast part of the state in the Canadian Rockies ecoregion. We'll then move to the southwest to the Columbia Plateau, further west to the East Cascades, then over to the West Cascades. We'll take a stop here in the Puget Trough, and then we'll end our journey with the Northwest Coast ecoregion. All right, so starting in the extreme northeast corner of the state is the Canadian Rockies ecoregion. And then this includes some of the state's wildest country, the Selkirk Mountains, as well as the Pend Oreille River Valley, are dominant landforms. And these mountains are transitional from the Okanagan Highlands to the west to more rugged and higher ridges of the Rocky Mountains to the east. Precipitation in the ecoregion ranges from about 18 inches along the Columbia River to about 80 inches in the Salmo Priest Wilderness area in the extreme northeast corner. And so obviously, at high elevations, you can get a lot of pretty deep snowpack as well. And the other thing about this ecoregion that's unique is that there's also some areas that experience what's called an inland maritime pattern. In other words, there's a lot of climatic similarities for some regions, similar to what we see in Western Washington. So in the ecoregion, we find alpine meadows and dense conifer forests, high elevation wetlands, riparian woodlands, grasslands. And overall, there's a lot of plants here that are more common in the Rocky Mountains than they are in the rest of the state. And then also we have some unique animals, large mammals such as moose and the endangered woodland caribou also live in these boreal forests. At low elevation dry sites, we find forests dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and that's true of pretty much all of our ecoregions in eastern Washington. And then that inland maritime climatic pattern I mentioned also develops what we call these inland rainforests, which are really unique. They're dominated by western red cedar and western hemlock, which are more reflective and representative of western Washington forests. And even some of the understory species in these inland rainforests are reflective of what we see in western Washington. And these inland rainforests are better developed and more more developed up into British Columbia. Also, forests dominated by western larch are common at mid-elevations. Western larch is a conifer tree, but it loses its needles, similar to deciduous trees. So in the autumn, it turns these amazingly gold colors, which you can see in this photo. They're really, really amazing forests. Also, subalpine forests are very representative of what we might find in Rocky Mountains to the east. And it's dominated by Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. So we get, as I mentioned, a lot of large mammal species identify or inhabit these wild country of the Canadian Rockies. Get white-tailed deer, mule deer, Rocky Mountain elk, moose, bighorn sheep, black bear. They're all abundant here. Less numerous, but very interesting are the endangered woodland caribou. It's a small population, but they do periodically range into the Selkirk Mountains. Gray wolves, wolverines, and grizzly bears. And the Canadian Rockies ecoregion is also the only location in the state for the red-tailed chipmunk, which inhabits mesic forests. This ecoregion is also the only location in the state where we find pattern fens. Fens are a unique type of wetland called a peatland, and the soils of these wetlands consist of peat, which is dead plant material. And these pattern fens are more common in boreal locations around the world. They form a distinct pattern of what are sometimes called ridges and hollows. So in this picture here, this greenish gray is the ridge, and then behind it are lower areas called the hollows. And actually, the Scandinavians have a much better terminology for this. They call them strings and flarks, which I think are just super cool. So Washington's only pattern fen is, well, best developed pattern fen, I should say, is a place called Bunchgrass Meadows. And this site is, you can see here, this is an overview of Bunchgrass Meadows, and you can see that net-like pattern of the strings and flarks. And there are numerous rare plants and rare mosses that occur in this peatland. We get a rare moss like streamside sphagnum or Sphagnum riparium. We also get a variety of amphibians like Columbia spotted frog. And then we have this rare damselfly, the subarctic bluet. And there's only 2 populations of this damselfly in the state, and both are in fens. Another rare peatland type in the ecoregion is called a calcareous fen, and these are peatlands supported by groundwater that's in contact with limestone or dolomite. As a consequence, they have a high pH and are very alkaline, and that results in a unique assemblage of species, including numerous rare plants. In fact, calcareous fens support more rare plants than any other wetland type in the state. Or most others. Seasonal wetlands also support very high levels. And you get species like yellow sedge, Carex flava, sage leaf willow, Salix candida, and this is my favorite little sedge called Carex anacrates, northern bog sedge, Salix brachiocarpa. Those are all very rare species in the state. And then Bucksbaum sedge is a bit more common, but also pretty much restricted to these peatlands. All right, so moving to the next ecoregion, the Columbia Basin is the most arid part of the state. It's the hottest and driest ecoregion in Washington because it lies in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. The ecoregion is primarily underlain by basalt, almost exclusively, and that basalt which is ancient lava flows, that can be as much as 6,000 feet deep in some places. There are also some areas of the ecoregion that have windblown silts and volcanic ash, especially over in the Palouse area. And those ice age floods I mentioned, again, kind of move their way through much of the basin, carving out, kind of stripping those hills of that silt and ash, leaving just a really kind of a moonscape in many areas. Precipitation increases from west to east. So again, about 6 inches in some places near the Columbia River to about 25 inches over in the Palouse Hills. Another thing to take notice, these dark green areas here, those are areas that have been converted to agriculture because of extensive irrigation that's going on. So a big part of the basin has been impacted or converted to other land uses. The Columbia Plateau is the only ecoregion not dominated by forests in Washington. And instead, it's dominated by ecosystems called shrub steppe and various grasslands. Also, there are special habitats such as sand dunes and lithosols or scablands, vernal pools, and we'll talk about those. Collectively, these habitats support about 45% of Washington's 829 vertebrate species. So the dominant ecosystem type in the basin is called shrub steppe, which is essentially a grassland with sagebrush species as well as a few other shrubs. Sometimes this is called the sagebrush sea, and this ecosystem type supports numerous rare and obligate sagebrush species. And what I mean by obligate, meaning that they're only associated with these habitats. So you get things like the pygmy rabbit, also the greater sage grouse, Washington ground squirrel, burrowing owls, and sage thrashers. Populations of these and other sagebrush species are low, and they're declining due to a loss of the shrub steppe habitat to conversion to other land uses, and also invasive species problems. Cheatgrass is a non-native plant that can really take over these ecosystems when they're disturbed. There are also grasslands in the mesic parts of the ecoregion, mainly in the Columbia River Gorge, as well as in the Palouse region in southeast Washington. The grasslands in the Palouse are often referred to as the Palouse Prairie, and they're essentially occur on ancient sand dunes. And I think all of these pictures actually are from the Palouse. Less than 1% of this prairie remains. The rest of it has been converted to dryland agriculture. And if you've ever driven over to Pullman, you've seen that conversion. There are numerous rare species associated with this grassland, including rare plants such as the Palouse goldenweed, and also the giant Palouse earthworm, which you may have heard of. This species has been documented to grow up to as much as 3 feet in length. Very interesting earthworm. So in numerous places in the ecoregion, inland sand dunes can form. And so species occupying these dunes are adapted to, sifting sand. They can form open or grasslands, shrublands, sometimes even woodlands. There are 12 rare plants associated with these active sands or sandy soils, including the state-sensitive gray cryptantha. Also, 9 vertebrate species are associated with these dunes, including the northern sagebrush lizard, which is only found in the dunes. And also the rare desert striped whipsnake is associated with these dunes, but it also requires and occurs in adjacent habitats near the dunes. So the total extent of dunes in eastern Washington has declined by almost 3/4. We've lost about 75% of it since the early 1970s, again, due to agricultural conversion. Some areas have been flooded behind reservoirs, and also some of the dunes are becoming stabilized because of non-native plants. Across many parts of the ecoregion, again, those ice age floods stripped or scoured off the soil that was sitting on top of the basalt. And so what you're left with, essentially in some areas is bare basalt or very thin soiled areas, as you can see in these photos. So very rocky, little soil development, and that means a very unique assemblage of species that'll grow in these areas. And so you got things like bitterroot, which is just absolutely gorgeous in the spring, desert yellow daisy, and then overall you dwarf shrublands, so very small shrublands as well as other herbaceous plants will dominate these areas. Vernal pools are a type of seasonal wetland, and as their name implies, they're wet in spring and early summer, but by late summer they're completely dry. Numerous rare species, especially plants, are found in these habitats. Most vernal pools plants are annuals, meaning that they live their entire life cycle within one season. And this is due to the harsh and extreme ecology of these pools. They can be, like you see here, they can be inundated with 6 inches of water, but by summer's end, they are bone dry. So you get things like showy dowangia, popcorn flower, various species of wild onion. And then we also have very unique invertebrate assemblages that can occur in these pools. And probably the most conspicuous one are brine shrimp. And so brine shrimp are common in these pools, but we do have a few species that are very rare and associated with this wetland type. All right, so Washington's East Cascades were modified by alpine glaciers and landslides, creating these rugged ridges with broad valleys in between. Elevations range from 2,000 to 7,000 feet, although Mount Adams over here extends over 12,000 feet. The lowest elevation, it's a little off the picture here, but is near the Columbia River Gorge and is about 100 feet in that location. The climate changes rapidly from the Cascade crest to the east, to the foothills of the East Cascades. And so you have cold, temperature with very high precipitation at the crest, about 120 inches. And by the time you get down to the foothills, it's dry and you have about 20 inches of precipitation there. The East Cascades is one of Washington's most biodiverse ecoregions and includes about 10% of the state. Like all the mountain ecoregions, forests vary in composition based on the elevation they occur in, the precipitation they get, et cetera. Also, grasslands are interspersed and embedded in these forests. And collectively, all the habitats in the ecoregion support 190 bird species, many large mammals such as black-tailed deer, mule deer, Rocky Mountain elk, bear, cougar, et cetera, and at least 20 endemic plant species. So whitebark pine woodlands occur on ridges and other dry areas in the subalpine zone, so higher elevations. Clark's nutcracker is a characteristic bird in these woodlands. They feed on the pine nuts. And whitebark pine itself was recently listed as a federally threatened species, primarily because of a non-native white pine blister rust, which is killing the trees. And that may be what's happening to this individual. I can't confirm that's the case, but anyway, that's essentially why the federal government listed the species as not due necessarily to loss of habitat. It's really this pathogen that's really taken it out. Another unique forest type in the ecoregion are woodlands dominated by western larch, and I mentioned that earlier. It's that deciduous conifer species. In this ecoregion, there are a few old growth remnants of these forests, and all these pictures are of those old growth stands. They're very open and park-like, similar to old growth ponderosa pine forests at lower elevations. They're absolutely gorgeous, and in the fall, again, they have that added benefit of the trees changing color. So they're really cool. Montane grasslands are found throughout the ecoregion, and they can range from being mesic to dry, so moist to dry. They support rare plants such as the federally endangered Wenatchee checker mallow, also the state-threatened Wenatchee larkspur, another plant. In the southern part of the ecoregion, we have the state-endangered Mardon skipper, and it is a butterfly found in a few of these meadows where it uses a variety of grasses and sedges to lay their eggs. The Mardon skipper population is low and declining, and range-wide across this entire range is only found in a few small isolated populations on the South Puget Sound, which we'll talk about in a minute, at least that ecoregion, the Southeast Cascades, where we're at right now, as well as Southwestern Oregon and Northwest California. So Gary oak conifer woodlands, Washington has one oak species, Gary oak, or also known as Oregon white oak. And in the East Cascades, these woodlands are found in the southern part of the ecoregion, especially where the ecoregion meets the Columbia River. And these woodlands are the driest forest type in the state. They provide habitat to many obligate oak species. One of three populations in the state of the state-threatened western gray squirrel are found in these woodlands, and the squirrel, uses the acorns for food and cavities in the trees for nesting. And also the state rare Lewis's woodpecker also depends on these woodlands. And the only place in the state where the California mountain king snake has been documented are mesic areas, so moist areas in these oak woodlands. So moving west, the West Cascade ecoregion runs southward from Snoqualmie Pass up here in the north down to the Columbia River Gorge. And it's, as its name suggests, it's on the west side of the Cascade Crest. It's a glaciated landscape with numerous river valleys. Peaks generally are 6,000 to 7,000 feet, but then we also have these stratovolcanoes like Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, and even parts of Mount Adams that extend much higher. As I mentioned earlier, Mount Rainier is about 14,400 feet. The Columbia River Gorge at the southern end, developed at roughly the same time that the Cascades were being uplifted. The Columbia River was carving its path towards the Pacific Ocean, and then those Ice Age floods I mentioned too also contributed to the magnificent Columbia River Gorge. So the ecoregion climatically is affected by storms that come off the Pacific Ocean, so it has a maritime weather pattern. Precipitation ranges from about 55 inches at lower elevations to 140 at higher elevations. And deep snowpacks can form at higher elevations. In fact, some of the world's, I don't know if it is the world record, but at one time, areas here, as well as Mount Baker up in the North Cascades, have competed for the world record for snowpack, like upwards of 90 feet. The wet and relatively mild conditions in the West Cascades support just incredible conifer forests. Mount Rainier and the Columbia River Gorge themselves are areas of high plant diversity and both support a lot of endemic plants. In fact, Mount Rainier itself is home to 30% of all the plants that occur in the state of Washington. And then the Columbia River Gorge has a unique biogeographic significance because it's a mixing zone from plants and some animals that are more common in what we call those maritime conditions, as well as the more Rocky Mountain species on the east side. So above what we call upper tree line, essentially the elevation at which trees can no longer grow, but below the zone of permanent ice, we get alpine habitats. So sometimes people talk about alpine as just being higher elevations. In an ecosystem concept, we're talking about a very narrow zone. And so you'll get alpine meadows and in heath fields, which you can find up there. And in talus, you can see very rocky areas. And in many of those talus slopes, you'll find American pica. So if you've hiked in the alpine, you're familiar with this little cutie. Alpine meadows in midsummer are often just have incredible, gorgeous wildflower displays. And one of my favorite species is Lewis's monkey flower, which occurs along little streams and rivulets that you'll find up in the alpine. Also, the state-sensitive Mount Rainier lousewort is a plant found in subalpine and alpine habitats. And as its name suggests, it is only found in and around Mount Rainier, nowhere else in the world. The ecoregion has an abundance of wetlands, as do many of our montane ecoregions, but you'll get things like really expansive montane marshes. You also have shrub and forested swamps and fens, those peatlands I talked about earlier, which are groundwater supported peatlands. In fact, the area west of Mount Adams supports the highest concentration of fens in Washington's Cascades. And these fens are again, sport not just rare species, but many species that are not found in any other ecosystem type. So things like mud sedge, Carex lamosa, podgrass, which is a really interesting species, Schickseria palustris, and then sundews. This is a carnivorous plant. You can see this pad here has little bristles that stick out, and you can see little looks like little droplets. Those are kind of like, I guess, sappy material that catches insects, and it'll digest insects. Also is the Van Dyke salamander, which is endemic, again, to Washington, not found anywhere else. It is found in 3 distinct areas in the state: Willapa Hills and the Olympic Peninsula, which are in the northwest coast ecoregion. We're headed there soon. And then here in the West Cascades. And this salamander is associated with cool mesic habitats like many of these wetland types, but also upland areas such as moist old forests and even rock outcrops where conditions are cool. So another unique forest that appears restricted to this ecoregion is a type that we call wooded volcanic flowage. These are open to sparsely vegetated woodlands, as you can see in these photos, that occur on relatively recent volcanic substrates, such as lava flows, lahars, and debris flows. And by recent, I'm primarily talking in geological context. But a great example of this is the big lava beds at in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which is where all these photos are taken. And also there's the state-sensitive golden chinkapin shrub. It doesn't necessarily occur actually in these wooded flowage forests, but it does occur immediately adjacent to it in other dry infertile forests. And this species is only found in 2 locations in the state: the southeastern part of the Olympic Peninsula and in this location here in the West Cascades. And there are a lot of populations around the big lava beds here. Also interesting, associated with this rare shrub is a rare butterfly, the golden hairstreak butterfly. That butterfly uses this shrub as a host plant. So a really interesting connection between 2 rare species. So as noted earlier, the wet and relatively mild conditions in the West Cascades support just incredible forests, conifer forests. You get Douglas fir and western hemlock at lower elevations. Western red cedar will be in more moist areas. And in Mount Rainier National Park, I think it's up the Carbon River Valley, Some of those old growth forests in there have trees that are up to 1,000 years old. Just absolutely amazing. At mid elevations, Pacific silver fir and noble fir will join Doug fir and hemlock in those forests. And at the highest reaches of the Cascades, you get subalpine forest dominated by mountain hemlock and subalpine fir, et cetera. Also, a species restricted to older forests and rocky areas in these forests is the state-sensitive larch mountain salamander. So Goat Marsh Research Natural Area is a place managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's just southwest of Mount St. Helens, and it protects one of the most amazing, I think the most amazing forest in the state. It's an old growth stand of noble fir and also just immense Douglas fir in there. And as you can see in this photo, it has a really open understory and canopy. It's amazing. I don't know how to explain it, but this forest itself, there's been a lot of research at this site, and it has, in terms of total biomass, it has the second highest total biomass of any forest in the world. Only coast redwoods down in Northwest California have more biomass than this particular stand. The productivity is amazing. So another interesting habitat found in a lot of ecoregions, but this one I think it's best developed, are waterfalls and splash zones where you get a unique assemblage of plants. And then many birds will fly around these areas too. So the waterfalls at the southern edge of the ecoregion, especially along the Columbia River Gorge, support a lot of rare plants associated with this. So things like the Oregon Sullivantia, Oregon Borlandra, and also the long awn sedge all are found, as you can see in these photos, in these rock areas adjacent to waterfalls. Basically, all the mist and the water spraying from the waterfalls keeps these, they're essentially wetlands on rocks, and so it keeps these areas very moist and wet, and you get unique species. Okay, so moving over to the Puget Trough, where those of you, that's where those of us who live along the I-5 corridor are found. So the Puget lobe of the continental ice sheet depressed this ecoregion at least down to Olympia area under nearly a mile thick of ice. So all that ice really depressed a lot of the ecoregion. Also, Puget Sound itself was at least partially carved by this glacial action, and that when the ice receded, that basin was then, waters from the Pacific Ocean moved in. Elevations in the Puget Trough range from sea level, of course, up to about 2,000 feet. The ecoregion has a temperate maritime climate, so mild, wet winters and warm, dry summers. On average, precipitation is about 40 inches, but it can vary quite tremendously across the ecoregion. So, for example, up in the Olympic rain shadow near Sequim, it's about 16, 17 inches of rain per year. Versus over here in Western Mason County, it's about 100 inches. So it can vary tremendously. And Seattle is about 38. Here in Olympia, we're about 50. So, there's a lot of variation in rainfall. Also, as I was just kind of alluding to, this ecoregion is home to over 75% of Washington's population. So, development up and down the I-5 corridor has had a pretty significant impact on the ecoregion's ecosystems. Historically, old growth forests dominated the vegetation. Also, that glaciation left templates for numerous rare and unusual ecosystem types. Freshwater lakes are numerous in areas where glaciation occurred. And then, of course, Puget Sound's marine waters are home to orcas and porpoises and harbor seals and just a really rich nearshore and deep water habitats. The majority of the ecoregion was covered by old growth stands of mesic forest dominated by Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar. Most of the old growth in this ecoregion is gone, unfortunately, but we do still have remnants left. And regardless of the ecoregion being gone, most of the ecoregion is still covered by forest. So we still have some, they're just at a much younger seral stage. We have deciduous species such as red alder and bigleaf maple, which are found in disturbed areas or more nutrient-rich or wet areas. And these forests historically supported the federally threatened northern spotted owl, but they no longer breed in the ecoregion. And if you've gone for a hike in these forests, you've probably heard Swainson's thrush song echoing through the forest, really beautiful. And then if you look down on the forest floor, you undoubtedly have seen our banana slugs, as well as the yellow spotted millipede. Also, despite being on the wet side of the Cascade Mountains, we do have dry forests in this ecoregion. So in places where soils are coarse and droughty, you can get Doug fir or shore pine dominated forests over an overstory of dry site indicators like Salal and Oregon grape. And these sites mostly occur in areas where there's been glacial outwash. So when the glaciers receded, they left a lot of cobbly and sandy areas. And those sites are well drained. So even though it might be getting a lot of rain, it's moving quickly through the soils, and it results in essentially a dry ecosystem. Also in the areas of those rain shadows, the Olympic rain shadow area I mentioned, we get a unique assemblage of species because the precipitation is much lower there. And some of the characteristic species are evergreen huckleberry, and then of course our native rhododendron. Another common location for dry forests are areas around rock outcrops, most commonly on bluffs that border Puget Sound waters. Pacific madrone is a very common species you'll see kind of hanging out over the Puget Sound with a grassy or mossy understory. So tucked within this whole matrix of forests, we have prairies that are also found on those well-drained soils where the glaciers left these coarse deposits. Fire in these prairies was also an important tool that kept these prairies from being overtaken by conifer trees. So over many centuries, local tribes intentionally burned the prairies, again, to keep the trees at bay, and also to create open areas for hunting. And also the fire ensured that the plants that the tribes were traditionally eating or using for other purposes remained healthy and vigorous. And today, natural resource managers have used the tribal practice and have learned from that to manage these sites to maintain prairie biodiversity. This ecosystem, because of land conversion and invasive species, fire suppression, is now one of the most threatened ecosystems in the state. And they support spectacular floral displays in the spring, including blue camas, yellow buttercup, the state endangered golden paintbrush. Also the federally endangered Taylor's checker spot butterfly, federally threatened Mazama pocket gopher, and the federally threatened streaked horn lark are all associated with these ecosystems. Near and around the prairies, but sometimes on their own, we have those Gary Oak woodlands again. They show up again here in the Puget Trough. But as you can see in these photos, these woodlands look a little bit different than if you remember the slide from the East Cascades, and that's because of the different climatic regime here. The structure and the associated species with these oak woodlands are different. But they provide critical habitat for numerous species, again, such as the western gray squirrel, which we saw earlier, the state imperiled slender-billed nuthatch, and then also things like western bluebird. Another unique and characteristic ecosystem of the ecoregion is our bogs. And bogs are peatlands that are predominantly getting their water from rainfall. So they're not connected with surface and groundwater. And because of that, they have very low nutrients and they're very acidic, which means they have a really, unique kind of assemblage of plants. Also, these kind of bogs reach their southern extent in Western North America in Western Washington. So bogs are also in the Northwest Coast ecoregion, but the bogs in this ecoregion are different than those in that they're drier in the summer, they're more shrubby. They also have less herbaceous species than the ones on the outer coast, and they're more hummocky. The specific moss species that occur here form big hummocks, where out in the coast it's less so. There's a lot of different rare invertebrate species. Some highlights are the rare Georgia Basin bog spider. I think there's 8 populations known in the world. 5 here and a couple that maybe 3 or 4, I don't know if it was 8 to 10. And then there's some up in British Columbia as well. Bella's ground beetle is another invertebrate that's limited to these sphagnum areas. And then some rare plants like Carex passiflora or a few flowered sedge. So there are a lot of other wetland types in the ecoregion: shrub and forested swamps, marshes, streamside wetlands. The Olympic mud minnow is a state-sensitive species that, again, is endemic to Washington, only found here. It's associated with wetlands and slow-moving streams. Similarly is the federally threatened Oregon spotted frog, also associated with similar wetland types as well in the ecoregion. So Puget Sound itself supports numerous marine ecosystems and species. Of course, our iconic marine species is the orca, and the federally endangered southern resident orca population in the Puget Sound only consists of about, I think, 75 individuals as of 2023. Salmon are an important food source for orcas. So salmon conservation and orca conservation they go hand in hand. They're intricately linked. Seagrass beds are a vulnerable marine ecosystem type limited to the Puget Sound ecoregion, and also Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay in the Northwest Coast ecoregion. These beds tend to be found with relatively protected shorelines and shallow embayments, and they're a refuge as well as foraging and spawning habitat for a whole variety of organisms, including salmonids, herring, Pacific herring, and Dungeness crab. So Washington's westernmost and wettest ecoregion extends from the Pacific Ocean to the Olympic Mountains glaciated peaks. The ecoregion includes about 150 miles of ocean shoreline. And you have, again, the Olympic Mountains, ocean shoreline, coastal plain, and Willapa Hills. It has a very strong maritime climate. And overall precipitation ranges from 60 to over 200, upwards to 240 inches in the Olympics. And coastal valleys have a lot of summer fog and very cool temperatures. So as I mentioned earlier, the wettest place in the lower 40 of the United States is in this ecoregion, and it results in incredibly lush rainforests, which support very high amphibian diversity, subalpine, parkland habitat, and alpine habitats. Also support the endemic Olympic marmot. And then the Olympic Mountains, as I mentioned earlier, are rich in endemic species because they are isolated. They're surrounded by water on three sides, as well as very steep gradients and unusual habitats. So we get tide pools along the rocky shoreline. These tide pools have a hotbed of aquatic diversity. Also, further offshore, you can get kelp beds. And Washington has 22 species of kelp, and that is the greatest number of kelp species, I think, outside of Japan in the world. So very high kelp diversity. Water birds such as the federally threatened marble murrelet uses open water areas in nearshore environments. And this particular bird is also associated with our temperate rainforests. The murrelet nests in large branches high in the canopy of our temperate rainforests. This region gets very high rainfall, on average more than a dozen feet of rain a year. And so this rain, coupled with mild temperatures year round, results in just amazing coniferous forests, some of the most productive on Earth. Many of the largest trees in the world are found in these forests. The Sitka spruce, western hemlocks, western red cedar. The forests support a lot of epiphytic mosses and ferns and lichens. And what I mean by epiphytic, it grows on the branches of the trees. You get species like Roosevelt elk, which is a darker and much larger elk than its Rocky Mountain cousin. And it lives in the old growth forest, and it can have a really significant impact on the understory because it browses the plants. So areas that don't have elk have a really dense understory. Areas that do are much more open. The rare Keen's myotis bat forages in these old growth forests, and they roost in the cavities of the bark of the trees and snags. Federally threatened northern spotted owl is also in these forests, and also many rare lichens that are only found in the old growth stands. So coastal dunes are found in the southern part of the ecoregion. They range from being not vegetated to densely vegetated. There is a small population of the federally threatened snowy plover in these sand dunes. Also, the state-sensitive pink sand verbena is in these sand dunes. So bogs, as I just mentioned, are found in the ecoregion, especially in the coastal plain, where glaciation left a lot of places suitable for bog development. And of note in this ecoregion, the only known raised bog in the western conterminous United States is found in this ecoregion. As you can see in this graph here, the top of the bog is about 3 feet or about 9 feet higher than its edge. And that's just because the peat has accumulated over centuries or millennia to be that much higher than its edge. This bog supports rare plants and rare mosses. There's a rare sphagnum moss, and also a very interesting moss called small capsule dung moss. Very interesting ecological niche. It's only found on herbivore dung in bogs. And there's two populations in Washington of this species. And then there's a rare butterfly that is restricted to these bog ecosystems. All right, I'm gonna try to move here a little bit quickly. The lower reaches of large rivers and streams near the coast have a unique type of freshwater wetland affected by tides. As daily tides move inland, ocean water is heavier than freshwater, and as that water moves inland, it pushes the freshwater that's coming down the rivers, it pushes that freshwater up, and that water ends up spilling over into banks and flooding adjacent areas, creating a mosaic of herbaceous and shrubland and forested wetlands. And we call these surge plain wetlands because of that surge created by the tides that come in twice a day. So predictably, they have a predictable flooding regime. Further downstream from those wetlands, you get salt marshes where salinity from marine waters is higher. And overall, the estuaries in this ecoregion are some of the largest on the west coast of North America, Western North America. Along the shorelines, you can get intertidal flats like this that are exposed when the tides recede. But going back to those estuaries, the Columbia River is the largest in the Pacific Northwest. It's critical for waterfowl, seam run fish, and the endangered Columbia white-tailed deer. And then Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor are other very important estuaries. So two more habitats I want to note, and these occur statewide. They're not specific to the Northwest Coast ecoregion, which we were just in. One are riparian areas, and these are areas immediately adjacent to rivers and streams. Again, they're found in all ecoregions at all elevations. So they range from those small rivulets in the Alpine to the Columbia River, which is very massive at its mouth. So you can imagine the range of ecological complexity and species associated with these ecosystems. They're very important for songbirds and of course fish, right? Very important for salmon and other fishes such as sculpin and dace, of which we have a few rare species in the state. And similarly, bodies of freshwater, ponds and lakes are distributed in all the different ecoregions. Very important for aquatic biodiversity, of course. So their diversity is high. And so that's what I wasn't really able to touch on, but there could be an entire other presentation just on our marine and freshwater aquatic diversity. So that brings us to the end of our excursion. And I know I just dumped a bunch of information on you, but really I've just touched the surface of the complexity and the diversity of ecosystems and species we have in the state. Hopefully though, I've given you a taste of the variation we have, and if you have interest in learning more, I'm sharing a couple resources here where you can do so. One is the website for the program that I manage, the Washington Natural Heritage Program. We track the location of rare plants and ecosystems across the state. And so you can visit this QR code and go to our website and learn more about them, as well as conservation issues associated with them. Our partners at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife have an incredible amount of information on the state's animal species. And another resource is Landscape Washington. This is a website that has a lot of information, especially about those ecoregions I was discussing. It was developed by our program, National Geographic, as well as NatureServe. And NatureServe is the umbrella organization for natural heritage programs across North America. So there's a program like ours in every US state and every Canadian province. This website's a little bit outdated, but nonetheless, the information there could still be very, very useful. So with that, I appreciate your time. I really enjoyed sharing this information, and yeah, if we have time, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes, we have a few questions in the Q&A. This was awesome. I'm walking away with so much information. I'm so excited to take this with me, but I want to make sure we get to some questions. So first question we have from someone, and I think this was right around when we were talking about the Canadian Rockies. What is the difference between a meadow and a fen?
Yeah, great question. So a meadow could mean a grassland that's dry, or it could mean a grass or sedge-dominated wetland, so area that gets water. And so I'll compare the fen to that part, that wet meadow part. And the difference there really is the hydrology. So wet meadows typically are just seasonally wet. So they might be wet in spring and early summer, but then they tend to dry out. And their soils, consequently, are usually what we call mineral soils. They still have sand and clay and silt in them, as well as organic matter. Fens are essentially supported by groundwater, and so they remain saturated year round. And because of that, decomposition is slower. And so the soils are actually composed of dried, or not dried, dead plant matter. And so that results in different chemical composition of the soils, different oxygen levels, et cetera. And so you get different species that can actually tolerate those conditions.
Gotcha. Okay. And we have quite a few questions revolving around Washington's trees. One of which are the oldest living trees and forests in Washington?
So I believe that's a great question. On the order of about 1,000 years, and the ones I mentioned for Mount Rainier, I believe those, I can't remember if they're Alaskan yellow cedar or if it was Western red cedar. But generally, our Western cedar is the oldest living tree, and I believe that's correct. And in terms of, now that may be different than which ones get the biggest, although the cedar do also get very big. But like Sitka spruce, for example, which is on the coast, gets very enormous very quickly. So it can get really big at a much faster rate than the cedar.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a great segue into the next question, actually. What are some of the native oaks in the Puget Sound Trough, and how fast do they grow?
So we only have one native oak species for the entire state, and that's Oregon white oak, also known as Gary oak. Quercus garryana is the scientific name. It's fine. I've got some in my yard, and they generally, and I've heard this from other people who have grown them. They can take a while to get their roots established, but after that, they'll generally start growing fairly quickly. So mine seemed like it didn't do anything for 5 years, and now they're just shooting up. In the wild, I don't know exactly what that growth rate looks like. It's a really good question. But oaks in general, they're limited to a very specific environment, and there's a lot of concern by some groups right now about many of our oaks in some urban areas being lost and things like that. And so they definitely don't grow as fast as, say, like Doug fir or Western hemlock. And part of that is the environment they typically are found growing in and where they're competitive, but also presumably the nature of the species itself.
Okay. And someone just wanted some clarification on the definition of what is a state sensitive species.
Yeah, great. So the program, the Natural Heritage Program that I work for, that is actually our task, is to we have a whole methodology, a whole systematic process of arriving at those categories. And so and you can visit our website to learn more, but I don't want to get too into the weeds, but we actually have a metric-based process where we're measuring certain attributes of the plant. Where is it located? How healthy are the populations? Is it declining? Is it stable? Are they increasing? What are the stressors associated with it, et cetera? There's all these different measures that we're applying to all the species, and that ultimately ends up in those rankings. Now, that's for plants and ecosystems. We do that for animals as well, but the official state listings for animals is done by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they kind of have their own process as well. And so I kind of mixed in state versus federally listed. The federally listed are associated with the Endangered Species Act, and so those generally have much more bigger implications on land use, et cetera, for where at least for animals. There aren't any really implications for federally listed plants unless it's something that the federal government is funding or doing themselves. Federally listed plants don't affect private lands.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'm going to try to combine two questions here. What is the most invasive species in the PNW, and what species do they threaten? And also kind of on the same line, what ecosystem in Washington is at the greatest risk or in the greatest need of conservation and preservation investment?
Yeah, invasive species, unfortunately, I wish there was just one that I could easily there's quite a few, but I'll pick some that maybe, I mentioned it earlier. Cheatgrass is a Bromus tectorum, is very common in the Columbia Basin. And I don't even know if it's on some of our noxious weed lists because it does have some value for livestock forage if it's eaten early. But that impacts some of our dryland ecosystems pretty significantly. So like in shrub steppe, especially if there's a physical disturbance, cheatgrass will just show up, especially in the drier parts of the basin. And the problem with that is it'll take over. It's an annual species, and so it'll germinate before our native plants. Like it might be, greening up pretty soon here. And what that does is it sucks up all the early season moisture, not leaving moisture for our native plants. And so it really can dominate areas because of that. And it burns readily, burns very easily. So it changes the fire regime of the shrub steppe ecosystem. Or it can. There's been some recent papers lately that also showed that in some areas it's not doing that significantly. For wetlands, I'll pick reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinaceae, and this is a pasture grass that was intentionally introduced. There are also apparently native populations of this in the upper Midwest of the United States. I think there was Lewis and Clark apparently collected this plant when they reached Washington. So there's some speculation that actually there was a native genotype of that plant here when they came through. But the consensus now is if that existed, it's been hybridized out of existence by the non-native invasive one. And that plant, unfortunately, takes over so many of our wetlands. It's very aggressive, very difficult to get rid of. And it just creates a homogeneous stand of this one plant. And so it has a very big impact on ecosystem processes in those wetlands as well as biodiversity. It just kicks everything, plant-wise at least, it kicks everything out. And a lot of other species don't like it. So for example, that Oregon spotted frog I mentioned, it likes relatively open areas to breed, and reed canary grass wetlands often are too dense for that to happen. So that's a conservation concern for that species. In terms of which ecosystems are a concern, I mentioned the prairie in the Puget Trough is a very significant ecosystem that has very high to biodiversity, a lot of rare species, and has been declined dramatically. There's been a conservation attention for decades, however, on it. So we're collectively, the conservation community, are really doing great work and trying to save what it is we have left, but it still obviously remains endangered. The problem is that it occurs in a very specific ecological template, and we can't really recreate that template much. So we're kind of constrained about where we can expand. But there's lots of things, with climate change, that begs questions about our bogs, for example, which are closely tied to precipitation and temperature. What is their long-term fate with climate change? And those bogs are my favorite ecosystem, so I can go on and on about that. But that's something that's on our radar as well. And there's a bunch of other examples. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much. We're a little bit past time today. So I'm sorry if your questions weren't answered. But thank you all for being here today, for such a great talk. This was awesome. As someone who's not from Washington, this was so awesome to hear and so awesome to see. I haven't really explored the eastern part of the state at all, so this is completely new for me. So thank you, Joe, for being here with us today. Our session today was recorded, which I will send a link to this recording in an email by March 5th, so you can rewatch it. The special exhibition, Søren Solkær, Sort Sol, which looks at starling murmurations across Europe, is on view until March 10th, so make sure that you get to the museum to go see it before it's over. But thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Joe. Have a great day, everybody.